Welcome to the world of Sci-Fi Stories, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Enjoy the listening. They enslaved a human and doomed their entire species. The alien slavers of the Zerth Dominion had conquered hundreds of species, breaking them, forcing them into servitude. They believed themselves invincible. No race had ever resisted them for long, not the six-armed Tovar, not the towering Groan, not even the hyper-intelligent Fire. Every civilization they touched fell to chains. So when they captured a single human, they thought little of it. The human had been found drifting in a ruined escape pod, the wreckage of a destroyed colony ship. Floating nearby, a routine salvage operation turned into an opportunity, another body for the labor. Pits, a species unregistered in their databases, which meant they had no interstellar allies to come looking. The perfect slave, the human, a male, was thrown into the gladiator pens of Zerth Prime, a world where broken slaves fought to entertain their masters. They called him Specimen 734 and expected him to die within a cycle, either in the arenas or from the brutal conditioning. But he did not die. At first the slavers barely noticed. Humans were fragile things, soft-fleshed and weak-limbed compared to the towering warriors of the Zarth. They dismissed his survival as mere luck. Then came the fights. The human should have been slaughtered by the first beast. He faced a massive tusked varl with skin like iron and claws sharp enough to tear through steel. Instead, he adapted. He learned the creature's movements, its patterns, its weaknesses, and then he killed it, not with brute force, not with the desperate luck of a cornered beast, but with tactics, with intelligence, with patience. That was when the Zarth first realized something was wrong. Over the next cycles, the human continued to win, not just in the arena, but outside of it. He spoke to the other slaves. He listened. He learned their languages, their histories, their suffering. And he began to whisper. The Zerth were a species built on fear. They ruled by crushing all hope before it could bloom. But this human, this one insignificant specimen, was planting seeds of defiance. In every broken heart, the guard started noticing changes. Slaves who had been obedient for years now looked at them with something different in their eyes. The fights in the arenas became more brutal, but the human never lost. Then one day he vanished. The slavers searched for him frantically, tearing apart the slave quarters, interrogating every prisoner. He was nowhere to be found. Panic spread through the ranks. How could a single slave disappear from the most secure fortress in the Dominion? It took them 3 days to realize what had happened. The human had not escaped. He had moved. He had infiltrated the weapons depot. He had armed the slaves, and he had started a war. The rebellion began within the heart of Zerth Prime. But it did not stop there, because this human was not just a survivor, not just a fighter. He was a soldier, and he had told the others what humans had always done best, what had allowed them to rise, to conquer, to endure. Humanity did not break under chains. They shattered them, and they made sure their enemies paid forever. Trying, the uprising spread across the Dominion like wildfire. Enslaved warriors from dozens of species turned against their masters, armed with stolen weapons and led by the human who had once been nothing more than a nameless prisoner. The Zerth fought back, but they were used to battling fragmented, fearful rebels. They were not prepared for an enemy who could strategize, who could lead. World after world fell. The human taught his allies not just to fight, but to win, to strike where it hurt the most. So supply chains were severed. Communication networks collapsed. Zerth generals were assassinated in their own chambers. By the time the Dominion realized the true scale of their mistake, it was too late. The human, now known by the name the other freed slaves had given him, the Harbinger, stood at the gates of the Zarth homeworld itself. And he gave them one chance. Surrender, he said, voice broadcast across the stars, or be erased. They refused, so he showed them what humanity did to those who tried to put them in chains. The war lasted 7 days. The Dominion lasted none. And when the dust settled, when the last of the Zerth warlords were dragged from their palaces and cast before those they had once enslaved, the galaxy understood one thing with absolute clarity: they had enslaved a human, and in doing so they had doomed their entire species. The Zerth Dominion, once feared across the galaxy, was no more. Its once mighty fleets lay in ruins, its rulers reduced to prisoners awaiting judgment. But the war was not over. The Harbinger stood on the bridge of a captured Zerth dread. Staring at the holographic display of the galaxy, he could see the chaos unfolding beyond the Dominion's borders. Power vacuums never remained empty for long. The Dominion had not simply ruled by force, it had controlled trade routes, diplomatic ties, and resource distributions across entire sectors. Without it, warlords, opportunists, and rival empires were already beginning to tear at the remains, eager to carve out their own pieces of what was left, and the former slaves, the ones who had fought bold and died for their freedom, stood at the edge of a precipice. "Your orders, Harbinger?" asked Captain Threx, a Grokon warrior who had once been a pit fighter like himself. Now he commanded a fleet. He was one of many who had risen under the humans' leadership. The Harbinger studied the hollow map. The war had started as vengeance, as survival, but now it was something else. The Zerth had ruled because they were strong. The galaxy understood strength. Without it, chaos would consume everything. A choice had to be made. Would they simply be victors of a rebellion, or would they become something greater? He looked at the faces of his commanders, alien warriors from a dozen species, all of them waiting for his decision. The Harbinger took a deep breath. "We rebuild," he said, "not just for ourselves, for everyone the Zarth ever enslaved. We will not allow another empire to rise in their place." Threx nodded. "And what of the remaining Zarth?" The Harbinger's expression darkened. The Zerth had shown no mercy to the species they had conquered. Billions had died under their rule. Now the galaxy demanded justice. "Gather them," he said, "the leaders, the generals, the slavers. They will answer for what they have done." The word spread quickly. The freed worlds cheered as the last of the Zarth rulers were dragged from their hiding places, brought before the people they had once enslaved. The trials lasted weeks. Some called for their execution, others demanded they be enslaved in return, forced to suffer as their victims had. But the Harbinger knew that vengeance alone would not build the future they needed. When the trials ended, a decision was made. The worst of the Zerth, the slavers, the torturers, the warlords, were executed. Their empire was erased from history, their home world stripped of its power, its people scattered, but for the rest exile. The Zerth as a species were not wiped out, but they would never rise again, never rebuild, never be allowed to claim power. They had ruled through fear. Now they would know what it meant to live in fear. With the war over, the real challenge began. The Harbinger and his people had to rebuild a shattered galaxy. But as he stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching his former slaves built something new, something better, he knew one thing for certain: they had been forged in chains, and now they would shape the stars themselves. But unknown to them, deep in the uncharted void of space, something watched, something ancient, something that had seen the rise and fall of countless empires, and for the first time in millennia, it took notice of humanity. The galaxy was changing. The fall of the Zerth Dominion had shattered the balance of power, and in its place something new was rising. The Harbinger and his forces, once nothing more than escaped slaves and scattered rebels, had become something more than just victors. They were rulers now, not conquerors, not slavers, but leaders of a new order. They called it the Accord, a coalition of liberated worlds, bound together, not by fear, but by unity. The Harbinger had seen firsthand what unchecked power could do, how tyranny thrived when the strong preyed upon the weak. He would not let that happen again. But not everyone shared his vision. Warlords, pirates, and remnants of the Zeri's old allies refused to bow to the new order. They raided supply lines, ambushed Accord ships, and spread whispers of rebellion. The Harbinger had expected resistance. What he hadn't expected was the message. It came from deep space, far beyond the old Dominion's borders, a signal encrypted in a way no known species used, and it carried a warning: "You have their attention. We are watching. We will see if you survive." The words sent a chill through the command staff. No identifier, no explanation, just a cold, impersonal statement. The Harbinger frowned as he studied the transmission. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was something worse. It was observation. Something was watching them. For the next several weeks, reports began coming in. Accord ships on deep space patrols went missing. Entire settlements, once abandoned, now bore strange signs of activity. Tools left behind, energy signatures that faded before they could be traced. Then came the first true encounter. A con ship scouting the edges of uncharted space found something impossible: an ancient vessel, derelict but intact, floating in the void. It predated every known civilization. Its surface was covered in markings unreadable but eerily precise, as though they had been grown rather than etched. The crew sent a drone inside. They received only a few seconds of footage before the signal cut out, a corridor stretching endlessly, walls that seemed to pulse as if alive, and then a figure, not mechanical, not biological, something in between. And as the drone's feed collapsed into static, the crew heard a sound, a voice, layered and distant, whispering in their minds, "You were not meant to rise." Then the ship vanished. The Harbinger stood before his advisors, staring at the transmission, his mind racing. The Zarth had thought themselves the masters of the galaxy. They had enslaved species, crushed civilizations under their heel, but they had never encountered this. This was older, greater, and now it was watching humanity. The Harbinger took a slow breath. The Accord had just won their first war, but it seemed they had only awakened something far worse. The Accord had barely begun to take shape when the first true sign of the Watchers appeared. A fleet, no, a shadow of a fleet, drifted at the edge of known space. Not Zerth, not pirates, not anything in the Accord's vast database of known civilizations. The ships were massive, impossibly sleek, their surfaces shifting. Like liquid metal, they hung in the void, silent, unmoving, as if studying the stars themselves. And then one of them moved. It drifted toward an Accord outpost on the edge of the old Dominion's territory. The station sensors flared to life, scrambling to scan the vessel, but found nothing. No energy readings, no heat signatures. It was there, but it wasn't. Then the station went dark. No alarms, no distress signals, just silence. By the time an Accord patrol arrived, there was nothing left, no wreckage, no bodies. The station was simply gone. The Harbinger stood on the bridge of his command ship, staring at the empty void where the station had once been. His officers whispered theories, cloaking technology, teleportation, some unknown weapon. But the Harbinger knew better. This was not an attack. This was a message. 2 days later, the Watchers spoke again. Another signal, no source, no location, just a voice rippling through every Accord transmission. You were not meant to rise. You walk where others have fallen. You build upon graves long forgotten. The Harbinger clenched his fists. He had led a war against the Zarth. He had built an empire out of ruins, and now something beyond his understanding was telling him that humanity's ascension was a mistake. He would not accept that. Send a reply, he ordered. His communications officer hesitated. "Sir, we don't even know where to send it." "Send it everywhere," the Harbinger said. His voice was calm, but there was fire in his eyes when he spoke. His message echoed across every Accord frequency, broadcast into the void itself. "We were slaves once. We were broken, but we rose. And if you believe we do not belong here, come and prove it." The silence that followed was deafening. The crew waited. Hours passed. No response. Then deep in the void something moved. The Watchers were coming. The first attack came without warning. An Accord colony, Val 7, vanish overnight. No distress signals, no explosions, no battle. One day it was a thriving settlement. The next it was an empty husk. Buildings stood untouched. Supply caches remained full, but there were no people, no bodies. No traces of a struggle. 30,000 souls gone without a trace. The Harbinger wasted no time. He mobilized the fleet, deploying scout ships to the edges of Accord space. Every patrol was doubled. Every survey was recalibrated to detect even the faintest anomaly. And still the Watchers remained unseen until the Retribution vanished. It was one of the Accord's finest warships, a battle cruiser bristling with weapons. It had been sent to investigate the colony's disappearance. Its last transmission was a garbled mess, fragments of panicked voices, alarms blaring, then a final message from its captain, voice shaking with something the Harbinger had never heard before. "Fear, they are here, they are inside. We were never silenced." The Harbinger did not sleep that night. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A science vessel. The EOs had been analyzing the last known location of the Retribution when they found something, a footprint in space itself. It wasn't a traditional ship's energy signature. It was something else, a distortion, a warping of reality, as if space had been stretched, twisted in a way physics did not allow, and within that distortion they found something small, insignificant, a single piece of metal. When they brought it aboard for analysis, the ship's AI refused to identify it. The onboard systems advanced beyond anything the old Dominion had possessed, simply shut down whenever they tried to scan it. It was wrong. Then the EOS received a transmission not from an outside source. From inside the ship, the crew gathered around as the message appeared on their monitors, written in an unknown language, yet every single person understood its meaning. You should not have touched it. Then the lights flickered, then the screaming started. By the time an Accord strike team arrived, the EOS was adrift. Not a single soul remained aboard, but the ship wasn't empty. The Harbinger watched from the bridge of his flagship as the first recon team boarded. Their helmet feeds streamed back to the fleet, showing dark corridors, flickering lights, shadows that moved when no one was looking. Then one of the soldiers turned a corner and froze. There in the center of the hallway was a figure. No, not a figure, a distortion, a wound in space itself, shaped almost like something humanoid. And then it spoke, not through the cowls, not through any system. It spoke inside their minds. You were never meant to leave your cradle. The Harbinger felt a chill crawl up his spine. For the first time in his life, he realized something terrible. The war against the Zerth had been nothing. The Accord was nothing, because something else had already decided the fate of this galaxy long before humanity had ever left Earth. And now they had noticed him. The Harbinger had faced war. He had faced slavery, rebellion, and the fall of empires. He had built the Accord from the ashes of tyranny. But this was something different. The Watchers weren't invaders in the way the Zerth had been. They didn't send fleets. They didn't demand surrender. They erased. The EOS was gone, not destroyed, not disabled, gone, a drifting husk, with no crew, no signs of struggle, just the whisper of a presence that should not exist. And then the disappearances began again. Station ships, entire colonies, not all at once, not in great battles, just one by one, vanishing into nothing. The Harbinger stood in the war room of his flagship, the Vanguard, watching the galaxy map flicker with new losses. His top commanders surrounded him, aliens from a dozen different species, warriors who had survived the fall of the Zerth Dominion, who had fought and bled for the Accord. And yet now there was something in the air none of them had ever felt before. Doubt. They are not fighting a war, said Threx, his most trusted officer. They are culling us. The word settled heavily over the room. The Harbinger exhaled slowly. Then we need to strike back. Silence. Finally, one of the strategists, of Alari tactician named Reese, shook her head. Against what we have? No fleets to target, no strongholds to siege, no weaknesses to exploit. She was right. Every great war in history had followed a pattern: conquest, resistance, counterattack. But this enemy had no front lines, no territory. It was as if they existed outside of reality itself, stepping in only when necessary to correct something, like exterminators purging a pest infestation, like gods pruning a mistake. A cold thought crept into the Harbinger's mind. The Zerth had enslaved and brutalized entire species, conquering without mercy, and yet the Watchers had never intervened. But the moment humanity rose, the moment he had reshaped the galaxy, they came, they watched, and they whispered, you were not meant to rise. Why humanity? His fingers curled into fists. It didn't matter. He would not kneel. He would not let the cord crumble into nothingness. If the Watchers wanted to erase them, they would have to fight for it. The Harbinger turned to his fleet commanders. His voice was calm, but there was fire beneath it. We hunt them. Threx narrowed his reptilian eyes. Hunt what exactly? The Harbinger stepped toward the holographic display, the strange, untraceable distortions left behind whenever a colony vanished, the eerie transmissions, the warping of space itself. We find the places they've touched. We follow the patterns we set traps. His eyes burned with something primal. They think we don't belong here. Let's show them how wrong they are. It started with bait, a false colony, empty, but with all the signs of life, a fabricated settlement, heat signatures mimicking a population, ships moving in carefully scripted path patterns. Then they waited. Days passed, then weeks, and then just when doubt began to creep in, it happened. The colony vanished. But this time the Vanguard was watching. Sensors captured the impossible, a hole in reality, a rippling distortion swallowing the settlement like a great MW. The moment it closed, the fleet was already moving, tracking the aftershocks, chasing the impossible, and they found it, a void, a space between space and within it. A structure, not a planet, not a station, something older, something vast, something that should not exist. The Harbinger stared at the image, Before him, his heart pounding, they had found the home of the Watchers, and now, for the first time in history, humanity was coming for them. The Accord fleet hovered at the edge of the void, engine silent. Weapons primed before them stretched something beyond comprehension, a structure, but also not. It shifted like a mirage, its shape twisting, bending in ways that defied physics. The home of the Watchers. The Harbinger stood at the command deck of the Vanguard, his fists clenched behind his back. He had spent his life fighting tyrants, shattering empires. Now he faced something that had never been challenged before, and he was about to knock on their front door. Weapons ready, Threx growled beside him. The Grokon warrior's massive frame was rigid with tension. We strike first. Hit them hard before they can. They already see us. Reese interrupted. Her voice was hushed, almost reverent. They've always seen us. The Harbinger knew she was right. This wasn't a surprise attack. This was an intrusion. And the Watchers did not tolerate intrusions. The moment the fleet moved forward, reality broke. 1 second, the void was empty. The next, they were everywhere. The Watchers did not arrive with ships. They became the battlefield. Space itself twisted as their presence unfurled. They weren't machines. They weren't biological. They were something else, shadows that pulsed with unnatural energy, shifting for forms that flickered between dimensions. And then, without warning, they struck the first Accord destroyer. The Resolute vanished, not destroyed, not damaged, simply ceased to exist. Alarms blared across the fleet. Weapons fired, but the shots passed through the Watchers as if they weren't real, until suddenly they were, and then they weren't, shifting between existence like a cruel joke. A Harbinger gritted his teeth. He had expected resistance. He had not expected to fight ghosts. Redirect targeting to ion fields. He ordered. If they shift out of phase, we box them in. The fleet adapted. Instead of trying to destroy the Watchers outright, they surrounded them, trapping them in bursts of energy fields. The Watchers faltered, not used to resistance, not used to being hunted, and for the first time they reacted. A voice rippling through every mind in the fleet: you do not understand. You defy the order. You are a mistake that must be corrected. The Harbinger snarled. Funny, that's what the Zerth said too. And then he gave the order: fire. The battle was unlike anything recorded in galactic history. The Watchers were not an army. They were a force, something ancient, something woven into the fabric of reality itself. But the Harbinger had built an army from nothing before he had turned slaves into warriors, rebels into conquerors, and now he was turning ghosts into prey. Coordinated energy pulses struck the Watchers, forcing them into form, making them real. Unreal things could die one by one. The Watchers began to falter one by one. They fell. The void trembled. The structure ahead of them began to shift, pulsing erratically, as if afraid. For the first time, the Watchers spoke with something almost like desperation. You do not understand what you awaken. There are worse things than us. The Harbinger stared at the impossible structure ahead. A gateway, a lock, a secret that had been buried for eons. He knew fear when he heard it. And the Watchers, these godlike beings, were afraid. He exhaled slowly. Then maybe, he murmured, we're just getting started. The battle was over. The Watchers had retreated. The Accord had done the impossible. They had made the predators flee, and now the gateway lay before them, untouched for millennia. Threx stepped forward. What are your orders? The Harbinger stared into the shifting abyss beyond the gate. The Watchers had tried to erase humanity because of what was waiting on the other side, and he needed to know. Why? Prepare a team, he said. We're going in. The gateway loomed before them, pulsing with a strange shifting light. It wasn't just an object, it was alive, or at least something close to it, a vast construct of impossible geometry built by forces that had shaped the galaxy before any known species had even crawled from their home worlds. The Watchers had tried to keep them away from it. That alone was reason enough to step inside. The Harbinger led the team himself aboard the Vanguard. He had commanded fleets, shattered empires, built a new order, but this was unknown territory. He needed to see it firsthand. His team was small, only the best. Threx, his grown second in command, towering and bristling with weapons. Reese, the Valari tactician, her mind sharper than any blade. Kara, the human engineer, the only one who had successfully studied the Watchers' tech without losing her mind, and a handful of others. Warriors, scientists, all prepared for the impossible. Together, they stepped forward, and the void swallowed them whole. For a moment, There was nothing, no sound. No light, no sensation. Then they existed again. The team, staggered, weapons raised, scanning their surroundings. They were standing inside a vast cathedral-like structure stretching endlessly into the darkness. The walls shimmered, shifting like liquid metal, whispering in a language no one could hear. This place, Reese breathed. It's ancient. The Harbinger moved forward every step. Echoed. He could feel something watching them, not like the Watchers before. This was deeper, older, and then the walls moved. Figures emerged, tall, impossibly thin, their bodies stretching like shadows. Not the Watchers, something else. They did not attack, they simply stood there. Then one of them spoke. Its voice was not sound, it was inside them, vibrating in their bones. You are not the first. The Harbinger narrowed his eyes. Then tell me who came before. The figure tilted its head, as if considering him. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised a long, clawed hand, and reality itself twisted. They were no longer in the cathedral. They were standing on a battlefield, not just any battlefield, the battlefield. The last stand of an empire older than history, a war that had been wiped from time itself. The sky burned, ships clashed in the void, shattering like glass, and in the center of it all, towering over the carnage, a figure, a being of pure darkness, shifting and writhing, consuming everything in its path. It was not the Watchers, it was worse. It was the reason the Watchers existed in the first place. The whispering figure turned to the Harbinger, and for the first time he understood. The Watchers were not gods, they were not the ultimate force in the galaxy. They were the keepers, the ones who had held the line against this for eons. And when humanity had shattered the old order, when the Harbinger had defied them, he had broken the last seal. The true enemy was awake now, and it was hungry. The vision ended as suddenly as it had begun. The Harbinger and his team were back inside the cathedral-like structure, gasping for breath. But they were not the same they had seen. The Watchers had not been humanity's enemy. They had been the last defense, the dam holding back something far worse, a force so ancient, so vast, that even the Zuri's cruelty, even the Watchers' cold indifference paled in comparison. Something that devoured, something that had wiped out civilizations before them, and now it knew humanity existed. The Harbinger turned to the shadowed figure before him, his pulse steady despite the horror burning in his mind. You should have told us. The figure's voice echoed through his skull. You would not have listened. He couldn't argue. He had spent his life breaking chains, defying gods and masters alike, but now he had invited something into the galaxy that no fleet could stop. Threx gripped his weapon. What do we do? The Harbinger exhaled slowly. There was no time for regret, no time for guilt. If the Watchers had spent eons barely holding this thing back, then there was only one path forward. He turned to his team, to the warriors and leaders who had followed him through the fires of revolution. We do what humanity has always done. His voice was calm steel beneath the storm. We fight. The Vanguard emerged from the void, returning to real space, battered but intact. The Accord fleet was waiting the moment they arrived. Transmissions flooded in, distress calls, alarms, reports of strange attacks across the sector. The Harbinger closed his eyes. It had already begun. The Watchers had tried to contain it. They had failed. Now humanity and its allies would have to face the real war. He turned to his fleet, his people, the survivors of a broken empire standing on the edge of oblivion. This isn't just about us anymore, he said, his voice echoing through every calm channel. This is bigger than humanity, bigger than the Accord. This is about survival. A pause. Then, if the galaxy wants to live, it fights with us. Across the fleet, warriors and leaders from a dozen species stood, their faces grim, their weapons ready. The Vanguard powered up its engines, and with humanity at the helm, the war for existence began.